Good morning. Good morning. And as Mickey Mouse's left ear opens up for the overflow crowd, let me welcome you all to our annual P.A. Christensen lecture for the College of Humanities. My name is Scott Miller. I'm Dean of the College of Humanities. We're grateful to have this annual lecture, one of 4 college awards lectures that we offer. And this lecture series for the Christensen lecture was started in 1977 to honor the memory of Dr. Parley A. Christensen, a beloved English professor who taught at BYU from the roaring 20s through the 60s. As I read that line over, because I get the same spiel every year, I thought, wait a second, those of you who've been hired within the last 2 years started your careers during the roaring 20s, and you might still be around here in the 60s, 2060s. He was here that long. He was educated in Idaho, and after studying at BYU, took his MA and PhD at Stanford. He served as chair of the English department for 20 years, from 1935 to 1955. Just hope, those of you who started 2 years ago, that you never have to be chair of the English department for 20 years. Among other things, he published a book of essays entitled All in a Teacher's Day. Professor Christensen taught at BYU for 38 years, retiring at the ripe age of 80. His consecrated service at BYU and his pursuit of belletristic excellence inspired the college to establish the singular lectureship to honor faculty in the field of literary and cultural studies. I'd like to invite all those who have received the Christensen Lecture Award in the past to stand now for audience acknowledgement. We'll begin with an opening prayer offered by Mark's colleague and my associate dean, Corey Cropper, who's a professor of French. Following that, Darrell Lee, professor of French and chair of the Department of French and Italian, will introduce Mark. So, Corey.
Our dear Father in heaven, we're grateful to be together and grateful to have this opportunity to listen to Mark and to be with him and to honor the work that he has done. We're so grateful for the gifts that you gave him, for his creativity and his generosity, and how they have blessed so many others in our college. Please bless him and bless his family. We pray too for our students and colleagues, and we're grateful again that we can be together. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Good morning. The Christensen Lecture is an opportunity to celebrate 2 individuals. And I'd like to enlist one, Parley A. Christensen, to explain why the other, Marc Olivier, is deserving of the namesake honor by citing one of the former's own maxims. The greatest need in higher education, he wrote, is the specialist who is also an intelligent dilettante. P.A. Christensen would need look no further than his alma mater for a perfect illustration of this. A dilettante is a person who pursues something fanciful, yet that person won't submit to norms. And this is where it gets interesting. Without setting about to transgress that norm, Marc instead redefines dilettantism itself through norms. You'll see. Turned into freeing forms of educational play. This is what he's going to talk about today. Dilettantism flourishes under the right conditions. Marc's title hints at one of those, insomnia. Insomnia renders one's brain a perpetual motion machine, and Marc is known in our department as the title holder for nocturnal cognitive unrest. There are other conditions. Dilettantism is never satisfied with what should be its proper field of activity. Some fields of study, paradoxically, actually have this built into them, and I can think of no other century fomenting dilettantism more than the 18th century. Completing his PhD in French at the University of Washington in 1999, where Marc's focus was on the age of the philosophe, those nimble thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot, who did everything but philosophy, Marc honed this intellectual trait that P.A. Christensen praised for higher education. It showed early in Marc's career when he curated an exhibit at the MOA. The exhibit was entitled Embracing the New Through Art and Design. In his dissertation, Marc had identified how familiar, nostalgic traits embedded in emerging technologies facilitated their social adoption. Things like ornate machinery or microscopes bound as books. But his exhibit was not about the 18th century. He applied the principle to a variety of objects. The exhibit featured things like a pink Cadillac, space-age television sets, brownie cameras, and more. And true to form, not staying in his lane as a curator, Marc also became a savvy collector. Another condition for dilettantism, it thrives in certain places. I'm certain Marc's mother Miriam and stepfather Bob, who are here today, would say his curiosity started well before Seattle, Paris, and the Provo where Marc has landed. But Seattle was a heady place to be in the 90s during his PhD. For example, Marc's conversations with his fellow bishopric counselor, who was a co-founder of Seattle's Human Interface Technology Lab, pulled him into the ecology of culture and VR. Paris has been another place that sows dilettantish creativity for Marc. My family had the good fortune of overlapping with Marc's in Paris for dissertation research in the mid-90s. Marc and Michel lived at 53 Boulevard du Montparnasse. And Montparnasse is the left bank's neon night answer to Pigalle and Clichy. Our weekly Wednesday ritual consisted of grabbing street food near the Rue Vavin and catching a movie on a Montparnasse screen, or perhaps venturing north to Montmartre to see a filmmaker at the Cinéma des Cinéastes. This was a proto-Sundance film festival, now one of Marc's annual pilgrimages. And no wonder that the cinema-rich quarter of Montparnasse, 6 movie houses, over 30 screens within less than 5 minutes on foot. No wonder then that that little area where Marc was would nourish the dilettante's monograph, years later, the film guide to scary stuff at home. This book was so well received that the University of Indiana Press recently appointed Marc a series editor for cinema studies. Provo, believe it or not, has also been a place of playful investigation for Marc. He and I were undergraduates in French at BYU in the late 80s and early 90s. And when Marc wasn't observing other student instructors, he was Chantal Thompson's enforcer in those days. We were running a French Readers Theater. You can already see the mischief in his eye. He's the one on the right. Playful experimentation continued after he was hired, with Marc precipitously throwing himself into stop-motion animation with Corey Cropper. If you scrub to the present, and those unrestrained experiments have now turned into prime examples of both peer-reviewed cinematic essay and mentoring, bringing together students from our college and fine arts in projects that have taken hundreds and hundreds of hours with a set of 2 to 3 students. And lastly, dilettantism also feeds off the right people. For Marc, that would be his family. Michel is a professional editor and every bit his equal, editing papers or reviving an 18th century wallpaper design. Their 3 children cover every musical shade there is. Max is an accomplished cellist. Lucas, a rocker in the burgeoning band Pool House. That's for Brian Price. If he's out there, you need to check out Pool House. And Ava, well, she's just deadly in musical theater. Together, I would say that they form a rather formidable household of dilettantism. And what else should you know about Marc? Well, for one, he has a flair for marketing. He redubbed the French club simply Le Club, as if there were no other worthy on campus. For another, he knows Paris street art and artists like few others. I think the college should run tours. This is my opinion of the interesting offices of the JFSB. And it could do worse than starting with Marc's office, which is a veritable cabinet of curiosities. To wrap things up, Experimental teaching is a hallmark of the humanities, and the French section is no slouch there, often inspired by French models of play. No Duchampian displays in classrooms for now, but other forms of ludic learning are never far afoot, sometimes in content, sometimes in approach. Hudson and Sarah Phoenix collaborating with others to teach a Dolly Parton seminar. But no one, and I mean no one, embodies play with educational purpose better than Marc. Marc embodies a new Provo movement. Playful, theatrical, creative, curious. In word, dilettantism. And I, for one, look forward to learning what sleepless years converted to knowledge and creativity can teach me about teaching. Please join me in welcoming Marc.
Okay. That was really nice. Since I've known Daryl for so long, that could have gone in so many directions. The title of my lecture comes from a P.A. Christensen quote. So before I unpack it, I want to say a few words about and by P.A. Christensen. I decided that I should read some of his lectures before preparing my own, and doing so makes me feel all the more honored to be speaking in association with his name. I read 2 books of his compiled lectures, books with innocuous titles like Of a Number of Things and All in a Teacher's Day, humble, benign titles that remind me of how Michel de Montaigne prefaced his essays with a warning to the reader that these were no more than the simple musings of a humanist meant for himself, or at best his friends and family. Yet despite the playful dismissiveness and modesty, what is true of Montaigne is also true of P.A. Christensen. His engagement with the human condition is far-reaching. It alternates between the universal and the specific, and surprises the reader with counterintuitive reflections that never shy away from tough questions. Let me give you a few examples. In his book, All in a Teacher's Day, Christensen's opening essay is an address to newly naturalized citizens given on May 20th, 1945, just 12 days after VE Day. So what did he talk about? The heroism of the United States? Patriotism? Nationalism? No, he talked about our common humanity, saying, "Let us pray that the world has heard the last of superior or master races or nations. Let us hope that we shall hear less in the future about promised lands and chosen peoples and about divinely established systems and institutions, no matter how sincerely we may believe in such things. Let us not make the Father of all nations a participant in any national egotism, partiality, or prejudice." Christensen believed that everywhere in the world, regardless of the race or people, there is evidence of a divine discontent at work, a feeling that men are more than animals, that their destiny is mental and spiritual, that as they progressively achieve new and higher ideals and aspirations, new and finer expressions of goodness, truth, and beauty, they move inevitably toward a world unity, a human brotherhood. In a 1944 talk at BYU, Christensen asserted, "Growth is the product of criticism and creative imagination. Painters, composers, poets, and prophets, at their best, are the great critics and great creative dreamers of humankind. Their work is essentially the work of description, of protest, and of promise." In a 1942 essay, he asks, "Do we not need more of that divine discontent which persuades men that life can always be pitched in a higher key, that all that has been done is little in comparison with what might be done?" Christensen was wary of anything that shuts down the dynamic of creative thought and expression and imagination. He points to the tragic paradox that the pressure to defend and preserve a particular system or ideology often shuts down the kind of thinking that leads to progress. Any obvious deviations from the norm are looked upon first as dangerous, then as subversive, and finally as treasonable. He asks, are we going to have the wisdom and the courage to release human thought and permit it to play freely and unafraid on every aspect of the human problem? His celebration of thought that plays freely sometimes led him to satire, and to what today we would call hot takes, for which his audience was not always prepared. I love that the essay Mormonism, An Eternal Quest, is included in one of his books with the footnote, invited but rejected. I wish I knew the story behind that. As the title suggests, the essay focuses on a continued drive to progress. It is easy to accept limitless time in which to learn, but it is difficult not to spend our days in futile reiterations of the little we already know. Inertia of mind and spirit is a disease that creeps upon its victims slowly and imperceptibly, and few are immune to it. Christensen loved the term divine discontent. He loved playfulness and restlessness, which I'm also quite restless, which is why I took my title from the following Christensen quote. I like to feel an unrest in all things, a ferment at work everywhere by which all things are trying to transcend themselves. It pleases me to believe that it is in the creative efforts expressed in the humanities that mankind is most distinctively transcending itself, most assuredly becoming something more than it is. I take unrest in all things, both figuratively and literally. As a chronic insomniac, much of my work is born from unrest, and I apply that unrest to all things, even the things we tend to ignore as objects of humanistic study. Things like refrigerators, remote controls, shower curtains, sleeper sofas, and houseplants. I describe my book, Household Horror, as Goodnight Moon for insomniacs. You may remember Margaret Wise Brown's classic children's book. It's unburdened by things such as character development and plot. It's basically just an inventory. In the great green room, there was a telephone and a red balloon and a picture of a cow jumping over the moon. And there were 3 little bears sitting in chairs. And next we get kittens and mittens and a bowl full of mush. It's a real page-turner. Then, having saluted all the things, we get to tell each thing goodnight. But what if this ritualistic bedtime chant doesn't work? What if we stay awake after all the things, after we said goodnight to all the things? Instead of drifting off into a blissful slumber, we watch those things take on unfamiliar shapes as the room goes dark. Philosopher Emmanuel Levinas describes that feeling of the insomniac looking around the darkening room as an awareness of the there is, il y a, a state where we experience the menace of pure and simple presence of objects as they melt into the blanket of being. Philosopher Dylan Trigg calls this a nocturnal ontology that threatens the singularity of the subject. There's a sort of flattening of hierarchies that occurs as the room grows dark. We are all equally things. We all have equal claim to being. And in this buzzing state of lively darkness under the gaze of the unfocused eye, we become aware of how there is something more to objects than what meets the eye, that their being exceeds their use. You begin to wonder about the hidden density of objects. Letting my restless mind entertain these ideas about the hidden density of everyday objects drew me to what has been called the non-human turn of the 21st century. There are many strains of thought that relate to the non-human turn, but I was drawn to the playfulness and humor of philosopher and game designer Ian Bogost, who described his adoption of object-oriented ontology as a reclamation of the sense of wonder often lost in childhood. Reclaiming that sense of wonder, however, opens us up to ridicule, because who else but a child would endow an object with as much being as a person? And so, just as Christensen invites us to play freely and unafraid, I would like to show you a few playful approaches to reading things. Approaches that let hierarchies dissolve, that allow cultural products and disciplinary borders to take on new shapes, like objects in a darkening room. Although I won't go into great detail, I want to acknowledge the thinkers and movements that inspire me to run freely on the intellectual playground. First, Diderot. I'm inspired by the 18th century philosophe Denis Diderot, co-editor of that monument to Enlightenment ambition, the Encyclopédie. Diderot believed that the key to active knowledge was not found in reading an article, but in making connections between articles. So he wrote 64,000 cross-references, creating ties between the articles that the authors themselves had never intended. And he invited the intellectually curious to do the same. I'm inspired by those who treat the world around us as a space for unexpected poetic acts. And these are all applicable to texts. Baudelaire and the 19th century flaneur, who saw the value of wandering aimlessly around the city, tortoise on a leash optional, attentive to fleeting connections. The flaneur took commercial spaces and, rather than shop for goods, simply bathed in the multitude in search of poetic connections. I'm inspired by the situationists of 1950s France who developed the idea of détournement, which is a form of rerouting, distortion, remixing, and diversion of something from its intended use, like navigating Paris using a map of London, or replacing rational street maps with words that you encounter along the way, or the feelings that you have while passing through. Maybe this is why the two favorite walks that I wrote for the Paris Walks book used by Study Abroad students are first Get Lost, the anti-walk walk, and a smell-centered walk that begins in the sulfurous bowels of the Parisian metro and ends at a perfume museum. I'm inspired by Michel de Certeau, who acknowledged that although we live within the constraints of spaces designed by others, we move about those spaces in our own poetic ways. Movement is a speech act, and we are all rhetoricians. I'm also inspired by the Oulipo movement, the workshop for potential literature, whose members were dedicated to building constraints, like rats constructing the maze from which they plan to escape, to quote Oulipo co-founder Raymond Queneau. And frankly, rats building a maze from which they hope to escape describes pretty much all scholarly projects, doesn't it? My scholarship and teaching are invigorated by those traditions of making new connections, of playful wandering, of self-imposed constraints. First, a few examples from household horror, which horror, I believe, is a rich area of study because it evokes childhood fear and awe, which are connected to wonder and imagination. It's a genre that values things as having a life of their own. So, why not read a horror film through its objects rather than its humans? This takes a leap of faith. For example, for my first chapter, I decided to take a film that I already found somewhat confusing and then read that film entirely through its refrigerators. What I found is that you can psychoanalyze a refrigerator without having to know how it feels about its mother. By imagining Lacanian-inspired psychoanalytic theorist Julia Kristeva locked inside the appliance section of a Home Depot with nothing but her thoughts, I realized that her theory of the abject, which is all about the construction of the self through expulsion, perfectly describes a refrigerator whose fundamental core is defined by lack, or the expulsion of heat. Imaginary Home Depot, Kristeva, would say, a refrigerator extricates itself into being. I won't go into detail, but one finding I had was that psychoanalytic models function surprisingly well without a human psyche. So, when I say my book is like Goodnight Moon for insomniacs, I'm not kidding, because it salutes each object in a house and then stays alert as the objects get scary. This is the table of contents. Each section of the book is a room, and each object in a room is a chapter of that section, an inventory like Goodnight Moon. I found a formalist model useful, or in dad humor mode, a form a list model. For example, if a movie is called Noriko's Dinner Table, why not list every dinner table? There's an anthropological term called food event that I replaced with table event, and then list every time the characters sit at a table, whether eating or not. There are 20 table events in Noriko's Dinner Table. It's a Japanese film, so I looked at whether the table was a high Western table or a low Chabudai table. Once you start looking at the tables and who sits around them, you realize the table's power to construct what it means to be in the family circle. Another simple formalist activity, in a chapter about the telephone, simply mapping out all the telephone calls gives a clear image of the claustrophobia and violence that's contained in the device in this film, as opposed to the freedom of advertising. Watching an entire movie through one chosen object is a constraint that yields meaningful results if we are willing to do a deep dive into the thing. We'll get there. I never thought I'd find myself in the basement surrounded by 1980s television repair manuals and plastics trade journals and a book on quantum mechanics, but these are the rabbit holes you find yourself descending when you want to look into the inner life of a thing. So when I wrote, what's happening here? A chapter on Poltergeist, my object was the remote control. Now, most people associate the television with this film because of the poster, but I believe it's really about remote control. So, in the spirit of playing freely, I constructed a chapter in many fragments, like zapping through channels, which takes us from spooky action at a distance to children's television to westerns to Star Trek to 18th century England to Spanish colonization to Google Maps, an excavation of a supermarket parking lot, Atari games, MTV, international satellite debris scandals, and all the way back to the Big Bang. It's chaos, but productive chaos that comes from playing with conventions by turning the chapter into something aligned with the thing that it studies. We've all heard of the infamous shower murder from Psycho, but what about the shower curtain? By shifting my attention to what the shower curtain brings to the film, I was able to escape some of the discourse around a scene that has been done to death. Again, this focus on objects allows me to play freely in thought and even in sources. I have a prologue to the chapter made of comments from Reddit and YouTube, and an annotated epilogue called Amazon Customers React to Liba Mildew-Resistant Antibacterial Piva AG Shower Curtain Liner 72 by 72 Clear, Non-Toxic, Eco-Friendly, No Chemical Order, Rust-Proof Grommets. Okay. My favorites, by the way, are who's the director? And I never knew that horror tune came from this. Gatekeeping which types of cultural texts are worthy of our attention is sadly all too common. Wikipedia, for example. Earlier, I mentioned how my Enlightenment crush, Denis Diderot, wrote 64,000 cross-references for the Encyclopédie. If he were alive today, he would be Wikipedia's biggest fan. And yet, teachers often tell their students not to look at it, as if serious scholars would never. But here's proof to the contrary, and a hack for young scholars. Okay? I did an experiment. I wrote a fairly obscure article about playwright and architect Jean-Nicolas Servandoni that it seemed no one was reading. So I did an experiment and added a few lines to the meager Wikipedia entry about Servandoni, along with a reference to my article. Now it's my 4th most cited work. So, use this pre-CFS faculty. Clearly, grade schoolers weren't the only ones using Wikipedia. My point is that productive unrest in all things and a willingness to play freely means we should encourage scholarship that looks at everything, not just peer-reviewed literature, but trade journals, online comments, ads, YouTube comments. Let all the things speak in their own voice and watch how it enlivens our perspective and adds relevance and nuance to the conversation. We should encourage restless wanderings. Creative thought thrives on intentional deviation. Sometimes a healthy dose of irreverence can prevent, to quote Christensen, the futile reiterations of the little we already know. Sometimes the best way to appreciate a work is to ruin it. My favorite 18th century French novel is Les Liaisons Dangereuses, or Dangerous Liaisons. It's a moralistic epistolary novel about a corrupt pair of aristocrats who go about ruining people's lives for sport. The prose is as deliciously beautiful as its antagonists are evil. What better work to ruin than a book about ruining lives? So, just as novelist Laclos helps us better appreciate true love by ruining it, I asked my students to ruin the 175 letters that make up Les Liaisons Dangereuses in order to better appreciate what we were destroying. Each letter would be distilled and translated into a tweet. Dangerous liaisons became dangerous tweets. Students competed to have their tweet chosen for the book. Everyone had at least one of theirs chosen, because although I study monsters, I am not a monster. So, the activity taught us about media, translation, the differences in communication in the 18th century versus today, and attempting to reduce a beautifully written letter to a tweet also helped us appreciate the strengths and weaknesses of each form of communication. In the end, I put together a book that we put up on iTunes for free, and it's been downloaded thousands of times from people from at least 27 countries. The project caught the eye of Oxford professor Catriona Seth, and was included in a multimedia project on Oxford's site and documented in a podcast. So ruining a work was more productive than I might have done in the past, a reading quiz or something. There are a lot of names that we can use to describe this. Ruination, détournement, translation, transmediation. One term that digital humanities scholars have used is deformance, or deformative criticism, described by digital humanities professor Kevin Ferguson as a wide range of digital experiments that generate heretical and non-normative readings of media texts. My foray into heretical media deformance most recently has come in the form of faculty-student co-authored, mentored video essays. The first was about wallpaper, and the most recent one, The Color of Fear, is a 26-minute investigation of the color green as a Gothic signifier from from silent film to found footage horror. I'll show you 2 clips to highlight the 2 digital humanities techniques of deformance: movie barcodes and summed frames. And we have BYU's own Jeremy Brown to thank for the expertise that made this possible. So first a clip showing the movie barcodes.
German expressionistic films such as The Golem, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and Nosferatu exploit tinting to express time, place, and psychological effects. The following movie barcodes of The Golem, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and Nosferatu represent those films in condensed slices by extracting and then collapsing the frames into a chronologically ordered set of vertical lines, each 1 pixel wide. The barcode visualization allows us to see the interplay of dominant colors throughout the film. By linking the barcode samples to the corresponding video files, we can scroll through a timeline of the films and better assess their use of color.
Okay, and here's a clip showing the summed frames technique.
The pervasiveness of technological mediation stands out when viewing a film through Kevin Ferguson's summed frames technique. These images represent a film by sampling 1 frame every 2 seconds and then merging all of the extracted images into a single composite representation of dominant colors and shapes. Notably, the camera interface appears with such frequency that it is burned clearly into the summed frame.
That was my grad student co-author, Michael Ashman, narrating. Michael and I were able to present our work at the 2022 Society for Cinema and Media Studies conference, and our video is currently under peer review for publication. So, let's hope. Deformance, remixing, and rerouting can apply to any scholarship and teaching. In 2021, in a summer seminar, I decided to upend the process of writing a research paper by giving students a prepackaged bibliography but no topic, and requiring that they write a paper using every source in my constraint-based bibliography and no other sources. They had 3 choices: The Narcissistic Professor, which was a bibliography composed entirely of people who quote one of my articles. Choice 2 is the Louise Labbé bibliography, which was composed entirely of authors whose last name begins with one of the letters in Louise Labbé's name. And then Roll Call, which was a bibliography of unrelated sources from people who shared the surnames of the students in the class. One of the ones ended up being a student's mother by one of the authors. It was great. The result of our experiment was that students engaged with the sources at a deeper level. They were forced to draw out connections between materials that were chosen by not a preformed idea, but playful constraint. One final example of rerouting, remixing, a deformative project. I just finished a 3-year stint team teaching with statistics professor Dr. Natalie Blades, and it really pushed the unexpected connections theme of the honors program to the limits. We combined statistics with, to quote one student, whatever it is Dr. Olivier does. And we soon saw non-humanities majors producing wildly creative work through transformative constraints. The 23 students in our 2021 section were so productive that they wrote 11 quintillion, 592 quadrillion, 840 trillion Petrarchan sonnets. Here's how. The sonnet is born from a mashup of 3 sources from 3 different centuries. Source 1, Christine de Pizan, the late medieval writer who fought misogyny by constructing an imaginary city composed of great women throughout time. Source 2, Louise Labbé, the audacious Renaissance poet who dared speak from a woman's point of view in her sonnets. And source 3, 20th century Oulipo co-founder Raymond Queneau, who wrote a book of 10 sonnets printed on strips that could be folded to replace any given line from one of the other 9 sonnets. The book's title, 100 000 milliards de poèmes, translated as 100,000 billion poems, indicates the number of possible new sonnets achieved through the variations. In the tradition of Christine de Pizan, each student celebrated an inspiring woman. To do so, they wrote a sonnet that used the same structure and rhyme scheme taken from one of Louise Abbé's sonnets. Then, in the spirit of Canoe, but with 21st century coding skills taught by Dr. Blades, the students created a website that not only allows you to read the original sonnets about great women, but also to generate combinations of the sonnets that celebrate the infinite potential of women. Here's a screenshot that shows the pull-down menu to look for the original sonnets. Here's a random result. And here's a display results version that allows you to see which sonnets are being mixed together for the random results. If you would like to read all of the possible combinations, get a water bottle and some snacks, because it will take 1,920 billion years of nonstop reading, or approximately 120 times the age of the universe. So, dissolving temporal and disciplinary boundaries helped us be more creative than the sum of our parts. Seeing structures allowed students with no experience writing poetry to appreciate how a sonnet is not derived sui generis from some divine muse, or at least not entirely, but that poetic creation is often governed by rules, like how many syllables to put in a line and what kinds of rhymes to use. Those rules teach us a valuable spiritual lesson that constraints enable growth. Playing freely doesn't mean abandoning all rules and structure. In fact, I would argue that being playful is all about making up rules in order to see structures emerge. Unlocking our own potential often coincides with seeing cultural objects around us in new ways. And seeing objects in new ways takes playfulness, risk, and childlike wonder. I have rerouted Christensen in this lecture. I don't know what he would have thought about object-oriented ontology or dangerous tweets or shower curtains, but I do believe, like Christensen, that in the humanities we can not only transcend ourselves, but we can be a part of letting all things transcend themselves. Not to make them more than they are, but to make us see that all things are already more than we perceive. Once we let the mind wander freely and allow ourselves to play unafraid, we can watch familiar objects take on new shapes. We can generate unexpected links between objects, and we can reclaim childhood wonder. And I promise you do not need to become an insomniac to do that. Thank you. I'm hoping you have questions. Does anybody have any questions? I believe we have a little bit of time. Just that stumped, are we? No, yes, please.
How do you choose what sort of constraints to put upon your work? I mean, being given it by a professor, I can see how students were able to create these incredible works, but there's so many possibilities. How do you decide what constraints to put on yourself?
Thanks. So, yeah, how does one create these constraints? Well, in the honors class, every student's final project had to be their own set of constraints that they created. And we saw people do things like, somebody did coding to translate to rewrite the entire book, The Hobbit, using nothing but synonyms. And I wouldn't have thought of that because I wouldn't know how to go about coding. Another group of students, for example, during the height of the pandemic, wandered around campus taking photos of discarded masks on the ground. Then they took geolocation data from Twitter and found conversations happening about COVID. Then they wrote haiku taken from the tweets and scripted them onto clean masks and put them all up over a map of where they found them and presented it to the class. It was amazing. So it's inventing the constraints is tricky. That's why Oulipo's whole thing is coming up with constraints. But I would say it's almost as hard sometimes as finding a thesis to a paper. But it's really rewarding, and it's great as far as students go if you can start by giving them some and then have them invent their own. Thanks. Other questions? Yes?
What object in your house scares you the most?
Well, I'm scared of all of our kitchen appliances because they die with just uncanny frequency. Otherwise I'm a really hard person to scare, unfortunately. That's why I'm always in a quest, and I get so excited if I go to a movie that scares me, but then I'm not scared anymore because I'm excited about being scared. So it is, it's a quest. Yeah, yes?
I'm thinking of like the Brave Little Toaster and Johnny Fedora and Alice Bluebonnet and Toy Story and all those things. So you're looking at horror, but there's also this, I don't know, what's the connection? Is there a connection between the Disney sort of genre of objects?
Well, I'm glad that you pointed that out because children's movies like The Brave Little Toaster anthropomorphize objects and that sort of shows the ability of a child to bring to life objects, and it's very appealing, and somewhere along the way we learned that that's silly and stopped doing it. But it is different from how horror takes objects that kind of remain objects and aren't anthropomorphized necessarily, but become really frightening. So I have a chapter about gremlins and the microwave, and we learned that there is an entire horror attached to the microwave. We use the word to nuke sometimes for food. People associate it with radiation. People are scared that their eyes, if they stand too close, are gonna get glaucoma or something. There's a huge amount of fear attached to everyday objects in our homes that's not dependent on making them anthropomorphic, but that means that we fear that they're doing things that we don't know. So I love that horror brings that kind of to life. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is kind of a question with some of your teaching projects. When you come up with something that you really like and are excited about that's new, like, giving them the bibliography or the dangerous tweets, do you want to do it again, or do you feel that you have to avoid becoming complacent with that?
That is a good question, because when I was interviewed about the dangerous tweets thing, they asked about that, and I said, yeah, I'll let other people do this now. Because it was very time intensive to do all the selecting and put the book together. The point that where my daughter Ava, she was, somebody asked her what her dad does for a living, and she said, he does this thing called dangerous tweets. So, yeah. But I would, now that I have a little bit of distance from it, I would like to go back or tweak it and try again. There's a lot of things that I would like to do, constraints on myself. I would love to take all of the different weird sources that somehow have quoted an article and do my narcissistic professor article and see what could I produce without acknowledging that in any way, with something that has articles on urban planning and articles on the family and all these different subjects that somehow tie into a thing I wrote about glitches. And so I think it would also be really fun to exchange bibliographies with a colleague and then force each other to write an article using that colleague's bibliography. That would be a blast. It's a challenge, but what you find is that when you're forced to do it, you can end up with all kinds of results that you never expected. Okay, well, last question, yeah.
Where does an insomniac such as yourself find rest? Because I can see how all of these pursuits and endeavors would be exhilarating and thrilling and enriching and life-giving, but exhausting. And at some point you need to pause and rest to continue your pursuits. So where do you find that rest?
Yeah, I used to find it through Ambien, but after I shaved dry in the middle of the night after not shaving for 5 days and saw the damage I'd done, I decided to go off of that. Oh, and I took a selfie in my sleep, yeah. So anyway, where do you find rest? I'm so invigorated by like games and things like that. I don't want to, you know, like I think that the rest is switching projects, you know, like I'm putting this one to bed, and now the nostalgia and technology stuff that Daryl showed, I got to a point where I'm like, I never want to talk about nostalgia and technology again. I'm putting that to rest, and, you know, for good. So, yeah. Well, thank you. I think we're out of time, but thank you so much for